Alright, uh, welcome everyone. Today I just want to walk through two of what I think are some of the more difficult concepts from this unit. Specifically, I want to outline two things, and we're going to go through our price floors and our price ceilings. They should also help shed some light on our concept with respect to shifts in our curves as well. But in order to assess these, all we need to do is build our baseline figure. So I'm going to begin by giving myself a starting demand curve. Whenever I'm drawing anything with like a shift, etc., I like to start with 0 for my subscripts when I'm drawing these supply and demand figures. So I have my downward sloping demand curve with a subscript 0, my upward sloping supply curve with a subscript 0, and then I also have corresponding prices and quantities. So when we are in our starting baseline figure, we should have all of these pieces. So in this market, first one we can outline that's commonly utilized, and the example you'll see in your text is a price floor in the market for labor. So price floor in the market for labor, you have a supply curve that is made up of all of us because we are all the workers. We're willing to go into the labor market and sell our labor for a price, and that price we're willing to sell it for is our equilibrium price here, and that's our wage. Now, we also have the demand side, and so the demand side in a labor market is made up of firms. And so firms, they want to produce goods, and so they have a demand for labor. And so same intuition applies. At higher prices, firms demand a lower quantity of labor. At low prices, they would have huge quantities, with quantity demanded for labor. And same thing for us. Not a lot of us are willing to enter into the labor market down here at really low prices, but if we start increasing that wage quite a bit, more of us are willing to enter into that labor market. So when we start in equilibrium, we note that in equilibrium, the reason we can just use these zeros as subscripts is because in equilibrium, our quantity demanded is equal to our quantity supplied. And so we don't have to bother ourselves with thinking about, okay, what's quantity demanded, what's quantity supplied in equilibrium, because we know those two are going to equalize when we're in this scenario. Now, when we're looking at our first concept here, so the concept of price floors, what we tend to see is that if we were to allow markets to just operate themselves without any type of government intervention, I just noticed, you can see this, sorry. If we're allowed to markets operate by themselves without any type of government intervention, it's likely the case that this equilibrium wage here, this P0 star, is going to be pretty low because firms have much more bargaining power relative to workers. And so what we end up doing is setting a price floor. And here's what that looks like. In our figure, the government steps in and sets a high price. And this price now establishes a floor, meaning that it is illegal to offer this product for less than PH. And so that's what our price floor is, or that's what our minimum wage is in our labor market. It means that you cannot go below that. That minimum wage is the floor. It's the bottom. And so we're artificially setting that wage above what the market would traditionally utilize. And so if we think about most of our employment that works in this area, so we're thinking about like fast food, retail services, things like that, a lot of times firms would be happy to depress those wages quite a bit. And so that's not sustainable. That's not sustainable for individuals to support their housing, etc. And so we need to artificially establish a higher price for that type of labor, because those are essential activities. Those are things that people are going to continue to utilize. And so as a result, we set that wage at PH star. And it's now illegal to accept any wage lower than PH star. Now, when we set that, we end up creating a little bit of inefficiency in the market. And so in order to figure out what's happening here, we take that equilibrium, or our new price floor, which is established above. It's kind of counterintuitive, but floors are always established above equilibrium price. And we follow it across until we hit each of our curves. The first one we run into is our demand curve. And we go straight down from this point. And because it hits our demand curve, that tells us the quantity demanded at that higher price. And then we follow it across until we continue and we hit our supply curve, take that straight down. And because it hits our supply curve, that is our quantity supplied at that higher price. So, with minimum wage, so with policies like minimum wage, we end up with a scenario in which our quantity supplied is greater than our quantity demanded, or we end up with a surplus. And so I'll provide some additional materials to highlight this intuition, but theoretically our model would assume that establishing something like the minimum wage or price floor above that equilibrium price would generate something like unemployment. That's what that surplus labor would look like. Now, empirically, we know that that's traditionally not the case, and that's because there are a lot of alternative options for firms to utilize if they would like to cut back on costs. Labor costs are a huge input, but let's imagine we are franchise owners and we're operating in the context of like McDonald's or a large retail industry. If our state establishes a higher minimum wage, yes, we have to eat the cost of paying higher wages to our laborers, but we could cut back elsewhere, and this is traditionally what we see happen. So that could look like maybe cutting people's hours below full-time, such that we don't have to pay health insurance benefits. It could also look like cutting back on 401k contributions, scaling back matches for each of those programs. And so, in terms of these minimum wage policies being established at higher levels, firms that can operate at scale, so our bigger firms, our McDonald's, or like your big retail like Forever 21, etc., they have the capacity to eat some of those costs and cut back elsewhere. The firms that are traditionally harmed most or might suffer in these cases are more so like your local small businesses, where that increase in labor costs might be a major hit to those firms. And so that outlines what happens when we establish some of these price controls. This first one here is price floors, and our price ceilings works in the same way. We just change our structure. So really quickly, let's take a step back, and all of these processes will be pretty easy to outline. But if we want to operate with something like a price ceiling, for example, price ceilings, again, counterintuitive, are always established below equilibrium price. So we have a lower price here, PL. Let me get rid of our market here. Whoops. I got rid of my demand curve as well. And my axis label. Okay, So I establish my lower price below equilibrium. And the most traditional one that we see here is in the market for housing. So what we generally see with respect to price ceilings, this is generally a policy like rent control in the market for housing. So what happens is that in a market, let's say particularly a market like Los Angeles, we have relatively high prices for housing. And so the equilibrium housing price is all the way up here at P0 star. Whoops, I didn't realize I got rid of my equilibrium quantity. So equilibrium housing price is relatively high at P0 star. And so the government recognizes that not all the individuals can afford to pay that P0 star. And a lot of times this happens in places in which we might see some levels or some higher levels of gentrification. And so as a result, we want to establish or maintain some of the demographic composition of the area that might have existed before. So for a couple buildings that we build out there, a lot of times we'll have a couple floors that are subject to rent stabilization or rent control, which keeps that price lower at PL star. And so for those specific units, it's illegal to charge more than PL star. That is the ceiling. So that's the max here. And we do the same thing. We take that lower price and go across until we hit each of our curves. Now that we're below equilibrium price, the first curve we run into is our supply curve. And the second one we run into over here is our demand curve. And so when we're talking about price ceilings, we end up generating a scenario in which your quantity demanded is greater than your quantity supplied, or you end up with a shortage. And so when we establish these government policies, they end up creating what we call these inefficiencies. If we don't have them, we would traditionally end up with this, right? Our quantity demanded equal to quantity supplied. In the case of the price floors, we established a surplus, and in the case of the price ceilings, we established a shortage. And so what we're weighing here with respect to our policy focus in economics, I'm going to scroll down a little bit, is that a lot of times these government policies are established in order to provide us with some type of trade-off. And so because we don't have infinite housing, because we don't have infinite labor or money set aside for labor, we have these scarce resources. And so generally the trade-off we have to face is you're generally looking at a trade-off between efficiency and equity. And so, yes, we do lose out on some efficiency here. We don't end up with a situation in which our quantity demand is equal to quantity supplied. But the goal of these policies, so when I return up here to our price floors and price ceilings, the goal of those policies isn't to maximize efficiencies. It's recognizing that if we allow markets to operate, firms aren't going to pay a lot of people livable wages, or we're going to displace a lot of people who are housed in this housing market. And so in order for us to mitigate that displacement or provide something like livable wages, we're okay with sacrificing a little bit of efficiency in order to increase equity in those policy situations. So that's the trade-off we're facing there, and that provides some context for kind of our out of equilibrium scenarios. I think the shifting side of it should be a little bit more intuitive, but if not, shoot me an email and I can help work through a little walkthrough of those concepts as well. So hopefully this helps outline your price control section, but other than that, have a good one.